The boy didn't scream when the silo door finally screamed open. He just covered his ears and whispered his mother's name like he was afraid the sound of hope might break her. I'm telling you this now because what I saw that morning still hasn't settled in my bones. And if you believe stories about loyalty, survival, and the thin line between cruelty and courage deserve to be told, tap like and subscribe right now, because this isn't entertainment, it's a reckoning, and it starts here. The moment that keeps replaying for me is the end, not the beginning. Rusted steel torn wide, chains hanging like snapped teeth, a woman in biker leathers bleeding but alive, and a child standing in the dirt trying to remember how to breathe. But to understand how we got there, you have to go back to the road just before sunrise, when the fog was still low enough to hide a boy from the world, and a convoy of motorcycles cut through it like a rumor that refused to die. I was riding sweep that morning, last in line, watching the edges for trouble, when I saw him, barefoot, too thin for his age, standing at the shoulder of County Road 12 with his arms wrapped around himself like he was holding his body together by force of will alone. At first, I thought he was a trick of the fog, one of those shapes your brain invents when you've been riding too long without sleep. But then he stepped forward, and the whole line reacted at once. Brake lights flared, engines dropped, gravel sprayed. And there he was, 12 maybe 13, eyes too old, hands stained dark with something that wasn't mud. Our road captain, Graves, was already off her bike before the engines finished settling, her boots crunching toward him with that calm authority that makes people listen even when they don't want to, and she asked him what he was doing in the road like this was any other morning, like boys did this sort of thing all the time. He looked past her at the patches, at the wings stitched across leather backs, and something in him cracked just enough to let the truth out. I couldn't find anyone else, he said, voice flat, practiced, the way kids sound when they've learned that panic wastes time. Graves asked where his shoes were. He said they fell off when he ran. She asked what happened to his hands. He said, "That's my mom's blood, and I swear to you, every angel there went still in a way that had nothing to do with fear. We get called monsters by people who've never needed one. But in that silence I felt the weight of every promise we'd ever made to protect our own, even the ones who'd walked away." The boy told us his name was Eli, that his mom rode before she had him, that she taught him how to listen to an engine like it was talking, and that the man who lived in their house didn't like any of that. Not the riding, not the independence, not the way she refused to shrink. So when she left him for good and went back to her bike, he followed, waited, and when he couldn't control her anymore, he took her instead. Eli didn't cry when he said it. He just pointed toward the silhouettes rising out of the fog a half-mile down the road, old grain silos abandoned since before he was born, and said, "She's in there," like he was naming a fact, not a nightmare. We rode slow the rest of the way, engines low, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and old rust. And as we pulled up on the silo, I noticed details that still make my stomach turn. The drag marks in the dirt, the fresh scrape on the metal door where something heavy had been forced inside, the way Eli flinched every time the wind made the structure groan. Graves told him to stay with me, pressed her forehead to his for a second like a promise made without words, and then she and a handful of us moved in on the door. It didn't open so much as resist, and when it finally gave, the sound echoed up the ladder inside like a scream swallowed by steel. The smell hit first, iron and oil and pain, and then the sight of her. Rena called her, once a rider who could take a curve like she was born leaning into it. Now chained to the wall halfway up the silo, wrists raw, one leg twisted wrong, blood drying dark against denim and leather, eyes fluttering but aware. She didn't beg when she saw us. She just exhaled like someone who'd been holding their breath for days and said, "Took you long enough," with a smile that broke my heart clean in half. Eli bolted then, fighting my grip, shouting for her. And I let him go because some moments don't belong to rules, they belong to truth. And the truth was that she needed to hear his voice as much as he needed to see her breathing. Graves climbed fast, hands steady even when the ladder cut her palms, talking the whole time, anchoring Rena to the present while the rest of us worked the chains. And as I stood there watching a mother and son lock eyes through pain and relief, I realized this wasn't just a rescue. It was the first crack in something that had been sealed up for a long time, and whatever waited on the other side of that crack was going to come down hard, because nobody shackles one of ours and gets to hide behind closed doors forever. By the time the paramedics arrived and the sun finally cleared the horizon, the silo looked smaller somehow, like it knew it had lost its power, but the damage was already done, to Rena's body, to Eli's childhood, and to something feral that had been quietly waking up inside all of us as we stood there listening to the radio crackle with updates we didn't need to hear to know the ending wouldn't be gentle. I stayed with Eli while they worked on his mom, wrapped him in my jacket because his hands wouldn't stop shaking now that he didn't have to be strong anymore, and he leaned into me without hesitation, the way kids do when they've burned through every last reserve of courage and finally allow themselves to feel safe. He kept asking if she was going to lose her leg, if she could still ride, if she was mad at him for running, and every answer felt too small for the size of the fear in his chest. But Graves knelt in front of him and told him something I'll never forget. Your mom didn't survive all this to ride away from you. She survived to come back, and Eli nodded like that was enough to keep him upright. The ambulance doors closed, lights flashing, and just before they pulled out, Rena caught Graves' hand and said a name. Caleb, quiet but sharp, the kind of name that carries history, and every angel there knew exactly what it meant when she said it. This wasn't a mystery anymore, it was a map. We didn't race, didn't rev, didn't turn it into a spectacle when the chapter call went out, but within an hour the roads started filling anyway, bikes rolling in from counties away, from neighboring states, from places that don't show up on maps, but always answer when something like this happens. And by mid-morning there were so many of us parked along the tree line that the air vibrated even when the engines were off. I watched Eli sit on the curb outside the small-town hospital, legs swinging, eating a granola bar someone handed him like it was the first real food he'd had in days, while Graves coordinated quietly with law enforcement. Not because we needed permission, but because this wasn't about hiding, it was about making sure the truth didn't get buried under paperwork and excuses. Caleb's house sat at the end of a long gravel drive, new locks on old doors, cameras mounted like unblinking eyes, and when we rolled up later that afternoon, it felt less like an ambush and more like gravity finally doing its job. I could see him through the front window, pacing, phone glued to his ear, rehearsing lies that wouldn't save him, and when the first door came down under a single coordinated push, the sound was so clean and final it sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with inevitability. He didn't fight. Not really. Just shouted about rights and misunderstandings and how Rena was unstable, how she needed him, how Eli was being poisoned against him. But words like that collapse fast when they're exposed to daylight, and as deputies moved in to cuff him, I caught sight of the back room. Chains coiled neatly on a workbench, tools laid out with care, a man's idea of order built around someone else's suffering. Later, after statements were taken and evidence bagged and the house stood empty with every door hanging broken on its hinges, we rode back to the hospital in smaller groups, quieter now, the adrenaline gone and something heavier settling in its place, and I found Eli sitting beside his mom's bed, holding her hand like it was the only thing tethering him to the world. She was pale, exhausted, but when she saw us she smiled, fierce even then, and told him he did good, that he saved her life, and I watched the way that landed in him, not like a compliment, but like a truth he could build himself around. That night, as the sun dipped and the parking lot lights flickered on, bikes idled low and steady like a heartbeat outside, and I realized this wasn't the end of the story people would tell. It was the middle, the part where consequences finally catch up and the people left standing have to decide what comes next, because rescue is loud and obvious. But healing is quiet, slow, and demands a kind of patience that's harder than any broken door. Eli fell asleep in a chair with his head against Rena's mattress, and Graves draped a blanket over him like she'd done it 1,000 times before, and as I stood there watching them breathe and sink, I understood something I hadn't that morning on the road. Some chains don't make noise when they snap, but the silence afterward changes everything. The weeks that followed didn't look dramatic from the outside. And maybe that's why they mattered more than everything that came before, because once the doors were broken and the sirens faded, what remained was the slow, unglamorous work of putting lives back together. Rena stayed in the hospital longer than she wanted to, cursing the traction on her leg and bargaining with every doctor who walked into the room. But pain had a way of humbling even the strongest riders, and Eli learned the rhythm of visiting hours, homework done in plastic chairs, and sleeping to the steady beep of machines that promised his mother was still here. We rotated without talking about it. Angels in ones and twos, bringing clean clothes, hot meals, comic books, a new pair of boots that actually fit Eli's feet. Never crowding, never overwhelming, just making sure there was always someone nearby, so the silence didn't turn dangerous. The case moved faster than most like it do, not because of who we were, but because there was nowhere for the truth to hide. The chains, the injuries, the witnesses, and Caleb's own unraveling left no room for doubt. And when the charges were read aloud in a courtroom that smelled faintly of old wood and resignation, I watched Eli sit up straighter than I'd ever seen him, his hand wrapped tight around Rena's. Both of them listening as the world finally said out loud that what happened to them was wrong. Rena cried then, not loud, not broken, just tears slipping down her cheeks as something she'd been carrying alone finally shifted, and Eli leaned into her, no longer afraid that doing so might cost him. Recovery wasn't linear. Some days Rena joked with the nurses and asked for bike magazines. Other days she stared out the window like she was bracing for something that never came, and Eli had nightmares that sent him bolting upright, heart racing, convinced he could hear metal scraping in the dark. But he wasn't alone with those fears anymore, and that made all the difference. When Rena was released, the house she and Eli had lived in felt wrong to her. Too many echoes, too many corners. So she didn't argue when Grays offered the clubhouse apartment temporarily, a quiet space above the garage where engines hummed below like a constant reminder that she hadn't been erased. Eli took to the place like he'd been waiting for it his whole life, learning names, learning how to hold a wrench, learning that adults could be predictable in the best possible way, and I saw the way his shoulders relaxed as weeks passed without yelling, without doors slamming, without fear sneaking up on him when he least expected it. Physical therapy was brutal for Rena, but she attacked it the way she'd attacked every curve she'd ever taken. Focused, stubborn, refusing to quit. And the first time she stood on her own without crutches, the room erupted in cheers so loud the mechanic downstairs dropped the socket. Eli cried openly then, not trying to hide it, and Rena pulled him into a careful hug, whispering that she wasn't going anywhere, not ever again. Months later, on a cool morning that smelled like rain and fresh oil, we rolled out to the edge of town where the old silo still stood, its door welded shut now, a warning instead of a secret, and Rena stood beside her bike, one hand on the tank, the other gripping Eli's shoulder as she took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep and steady. She didn't ride far that day, just a slow loop around the block, careful and deliberate. But when she pulled back in and cut the engine, Eli ran to her like she'd just crossed an ocean, and she laughed in a way I hadn't heard before, lighter, freer, like something inside her had finally unclenched. Life didn't turn perfect after that. It never does. There were court dates, counseling sessions, hard conversations about trust and anger and the parts of the past that don't disappear just because you want them to. But there were also dinners that ran long, homework done at the same table every night, and a boy who learned that strength could look like asking for help instead of running barefoot into the fog. The last time I saw them before they moved into a small place of their own, Eli handed me a drawing he'd been working on for weeks. A line of motorcycles stretched across a road at sunrise, wings on every back, and in the center, a woman and a child standing hand in hand with a broken chain at their feet. "That's you," he said simply, like it was obvious, and I told him he got it wrong, that it wasn't us. It was him. But he just smiled, that quiet, knowing smile of a kid who's seen the worst and survived it. As I watched them ride away that day, Rena careful, Eli steady behind her, I understood something I've felt but never named. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment alone. It's about making sure the people who were hurt get the chance to live loudly again. And sometimes family isn't who you're born to, but who shows up when a lost boy steps into the road and asks the world to stop.